Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for today's Lunch and Learn session. This is an informal brown bag session. Today we're joined by Brandon Palin, Dan Ross, and Thomas Peck from Ecopia AI. And they're here to talk about funding opportunities available to government agencies. I'm gonna turn it over to them now and ask them to give maybe a better introduction of themselves and go ahead and get started in the session. I'll ask you to hold your questions till the end, or you can enter them in the chat and we'll get to them sort of toward the end of the presentation. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Dan or Brandon or Thomas.
Sure. Yeah, why don't I kick things off here in terms of that, and then we'll pass it to Dan and Thomas. But Brandon Palin, I'm the Senior Director for Public Sector at Ecopia. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. So Arthur, thank you so much for putting this together. The goal of today's conversation is to bring the concepts together of aligning geospatial data resources to funding opportunities that we've seen as direct opportunities for other states, other counties, but also just to holistically look at how to kind of navigate that grant market. So, well, we should have a somewhat of an engaging conversation. We'll give a brief introduction to Ecopia and the work that we're doing, and then we'll jump right into some of the grant strategy elements and even do a brief review to show you guys how some other groups have successfully managed to integrate those programs, or likewise some of the similar use cases that are aligned to those grants. Dan, do you want to kind of jump in?
Sure. Thanks, Brandon, and thanks everybody who joined today. Brandon hit the nail on the head. We're primarily going to focus on, at least I'm going to focus on the funding aspect of it. I know that funding is always a challenge in many of these cases, and one of the things that we as Ecopia want to do is when we're aware of funding that may help you as a state or a county, we want to share that information with you. So I'll be talking a little bit about that. I come from 28 years in government myself. I was in Minnesota government for almost all of that 28 years, spent a little time in the education system as well. So I look forward to talking with you all today.
And I'll just introduce myself briefly here as well. I'm excited for the opportunity to speak with all of you today. Thanks a lot for coming. I am an associate in the public sector at Ecopia. I work with all 50 states, connecting them with different use cases to support their geospatial data priorities. And I will be covering most of the transportation stuff that will be on the agenda today. And with that, I'll bring it back to Brandon to start the presentation.
All righty. So I know we have an audience here that comes from, a variety of different departments and with that different use cases and interests. But before, I feel like I can even address that, I feel like it's always important to give a little bit of credibility. So, why are we sitting at the table here to demonstrate how geospatial data is aligning with grants and funding opportunities? And so our story actually begins about 11 years ago in terms of our commercialization. So Ecopia is a geospatial data services company that leverages the power of artificial intelligence to extract features from imagery. Essentially, that's a long-winded way of saying we extract data from imagery pretty efficiently. And that process started with building footprints. So AI now is what I would equate to a buzz topic, especially since the release of OpenAI's ChatGPT. We're seeing a lot more interest, and it's become a forefront conversation amongst end users and trying to say, okay, how can I integrate AI? Well, back when we first started, things like cloud computing didn't exist. So the concepts of deep learning, feature extraction, all of this was not such a common industry methodology, especially in geospatial. So we're very much at what I would classify as the forefront of innovation in this industry. And with that, we started scaling our solutions, and we focused on building footprints, and we are very, very focused on just that one product, because ultimately what we wanted to achieve was data extraction, leveraging our AI and essentially the efficiencies that are with that, but all while retaining the accuracies of what you would have from a traditional heads-up digitization or human annotation. So our progression is essentially scaled. Thomas, go back for 1 sec, just round it out. Right?
Yep.
This is what happened. We got 3 people trying to run a deck here, so I'm sure that won't be the first time that happens today. But we started off with our large first project was mapping all of Australia. You can see it's 60 million structures in a period of 6 months, about 3 million square miles. The next year, just to demonstrate the progression of technology, we mapped all of the US, every single building footprint across the US. Same amount of time, but 169 million building footprints. So that kind of speaks to the iterative development of the technology and kind of lends to where we are today. And where we are today is essentially transitioning and developing our solutions to encompass both natural and man-made features. And with that, we're working along a host of solutions that, Thomas, you can go to the next slide now, that are servicing multiple verticals, civil engineering, telecommunications, government, insurance. Ultimately, what Ecopia is doing is providing data to all of these groups that is supporting a network of end use cases. Specifically, the ones that I'm going to kind of talk about a lot more today are related to a lot of climate resiliency initiatives. We're going to talk about pedestrian safety initiatives. We're going to talk about large-scale data development to develop an understanding of our environment today. So I know this isn't grants yet, but I want to paint the picture of how geospatial data fits into this and how we come in. So just a couple more slides on this, and then we'll jump right in. So the capstone project and kind of the narrative behind our work and what I would say is the precipice for this conversation is our nationwide 3D land cover map. And ultimately what this is a first of its kind data development. And just to put this into context, so for each of you in this group, I assume you've touched geospatial at one point or another, depending on your capacities. So maybe you've leveraged a building footprint layer. Maybe you've leveraged road polygons or road center lines. Perhaps you're even using a forest canopy inventory or shrub inventory, just general vegetation. Ultimately, what Ecopia has done is created a system or processes on our side to develop this data at large scales. And effectively, this is powering a lot of solutions. And ultimately, some of this data is actually going to be, well, is now available to you guys for free. So we've worked alongside NOAA over the last 18 months. And with that, actually just 2 weeks ago, it was formally released. You'll notice Hawaii is on that list. It says NV5 there. They are the prime contractor. Ecopia acts as a sub-consultant to them, but we do all the feature extraction. It's just part of contracting vehicles with NOAA. And essentially, the data set that's being made available is an impervious canopy, which is high vegetation and low vegetation, and open water data set at a 1 meter raster layer. All of that data is derived, though, using a mix of 6 and 12-inch pixel resolution aerial imagery. So it's a super exciting solution. And ultimately, that data set will be really critical in terms of developing and supporting probably some of your geospatial strategies. And likewise, could be a critical asset in supporting grant development and perhaps even looking at getting access to higher resolution products. So when I talk about geospatial strategy, and we start to get more towards the concept of funding applications, these are the key themes I want you to think about as we go through the conversations today. So geospatial data, you know, depending on the landscape, we sometimes, especially as if maybe you're in the GIS department, you know, you think of the data itself. But it's important to align the data itself with that end use case, because ultimately, especially from a funding standpoint, that end use case is what dictates access to resources to build these. legislative bodies or the people that are making decisions in terms of funding applications or who's allocating resources, they're not going to understand the value of impervious surfaces, but they're going to understand the fact that if you can use a data set to help understand tidal surge and which communities are going to be most impacted and being able to mitigate risk for those communities, that's something that resonates with them. Likewise, situations in terms of wildfires, understanding where populations are, understanding how fire can spread depending on the different types of vegetation. Similarly, we think about what I would categorize as the largest natural problem in the United States right now. Urban heat and extreme heat is what's killed more people from natural disasters over the past year than anything else. Over any sort of natural disaster, hurricanes, tornadoes, nope, it's urban heat that is doing it. Likewise, data sets like geospatial data, having access to building footprints, impervious surfaces, canopy, enables you to build a direct granular understanding of which communities are most at risk and how to direct investments to solve that problem. And so finally, we get to the point of actually talking about what I believe most of you are here for, is getting to know the grants. And with that, Dan is going to do a great job to walk you through that. And yeah, Dan, why don't you jump right in and just kick us off? Oh, Dan, you're muted.
Indeed, I am. I do that once in every meeting. So at least the team I work with at Ecopia knows that. So they're very good about prompting me. Anyway, thanks for that background, Brandon. That gives folks a little bit of sense of where we're coming from. And really the reason I raised funding is because this is a message that we keep hearing from those that we're talking to in states and counties. And one of them or two of them or 10 of them, the things they're saying are, we're challenged with funding. Well, one of the things we wanted to bring to the table was there's lots of federal money out there. So we wanted to give states an opportunity to learn a little bit more about that. Thomas, could you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. For those of you that are familiar with grants and how to access grants and understand grants, I apologize. Some of this is going to be a basic intro to where you're at. But for those of you that are not, we're going to start with grants.gov. If you want to know where the federal grants are and all the money that's out there and all the different programs, it all starts with grants.gov. And anybody can go here. This is open to the public. You don't have to sign in initially, but you will find out that as you pursue grants, you're going to have to create some federal accounts in order to be able to actually participate in grants. But today we just wanted to help you understand how to get access to some of this information. So with that in mind, it's grants.gov. Some of those things that I'm not going to go through grants.gov right now. I'm going to show you some examples of both how you look at things. And then I did share a spreadsheet with Arthur. He's going to put a link to that in the chat. I actually shared two documents with Arthur that will give you some reports that we can pull out of grants.gov that give you some more detailed information. And we'll dig into some of that, some of the grant opportunities as we get farther down. But for grants.gov, you got to look at the basics. And you can search for things like the type of funding. Generally, you're going to look at cooperative agreements. In a cooperative agreement, any agency that you work with, you'll be working closely with them on a cooperative agreement. A grant itself is a little bit different. That's where you're going to have less interaction with that agency, and the money's going to be available a little bit different way without as much input from the organization granting it. There are some different ones that apply to only certain things. And each one of those is specific to the grant that is being put out there in that category. You can search by category, the different acts that are out there, the different funding sources, and the different topics. You can see agriculture there and arts and cultural affairs, and that list goes on for quite a ways. One of the things I do most, and something you're going to see in the spreadsheet that Arthur's going to share, is you can search by agency. You as agencies and state government likely work with the same sector in the federal government. You can see what they're providing there. And then along with that, you can look at the types of eligibility. In this case, the report that I pulled from here that we obtained from grants.gov, you'll see that I include some, mostly state, but then there's some local in there and even some nonprofits. And I did that for a reason. As you get into that, one of the things that funding does is it gives you an opportunity to talk to others in the same sector to bring things together. So those are some basic things about grants.gov and the ways you can search in there. Now we're going to take it a step farther now and dig into what are grants themselves. As you dig into those grants, you're going to have to be aware that there's really 3 different phases of a grant. One is the pre-award, and that's usually where you have to put in an application that meets a certain set of criteria. And you don't necessarily get the money right away. There's an evaluation period after that. If you are indeed asked to participate in the grant process, you'll come in with a more full-fledged plan about what you're going to do with that money. I'm going to encourage you to make sure that in phase 1 up there, that you really make sure you answer all of the requirements that are in those, what we call a NOFO. You saw that on the previous slide. I should have explained that a little bit farther. A NOFO is just simply a notice of funding opportunity. In the second phase, that's where you're going to do the meat of the work. And in the post-award, that's really closing it out. What you need to be aware of here is that different agencies and different grants will want to react with you in a different way in each of these phases. FEMA has this thing called FEMA Go, where that's where you have to interact with them on those grants. Could we go to the next slide, Thomas? So those are some basics about the grants that are out there. Today, we picked out 6 or 8 that we think fit well with not only Hawaii, but many states. And the reason mostly that we're bringing them up is they are general competition, which gives you or your state access to in the cases that we're going to present here, a significant amount of money. So in this case, EPA has a climate pollution reduction grant program. It's a general competition program, and they're making $4.3 billion available over the next 4 years. Now, this was actually announced a few months ago, so it is open right now. And you can get anywhere from $2 million for a planning grant to $500 million for an implementation grant. So you heard me say there's 2 different kinds of grants there. And one of the cool things about this particular grant is there's no cost share. That doesn't usually happen. You're going to find that as you go through the different types of grants, there's usually an 80-20 match or a 75-25, those sorts of things. This one we pulled out as an opportunity for states because it fits with that whole pollution carbon / reduction where data fits right in with that. Your priority climate action plan. So states were all given money to create a priority climate action plan. That plan is due March 1st of 2024. So I'm not sure which agency in Hawaii will have done that climate action plan, but there may be an opportunity for you as agencies to come together to add to that plan in terms of supporting that with geospatial data. You can see that the eligibility there is for states and metro statistical areas, municipalities, tribes, and of course the air pollution control agencies. I give you just a sample of the eligible activities there. I apologize that the text on the bottom may be a little hard for you to see, but it's really the implementation of those plans in this next phase here that's going to take place in what you actually do on the ground. So there's an example of one from the Environmental Protection Agency. The next 2 are from FEMA. The first one called Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities BRIC program. This is an annual grant that comes up. It's for $1 billion, but you get to spend that $1 billion over the 3 years. So, and of course, it's not all going to go one place. They have 2 different kinds. They have a $2 million cap on the capacity and capability and capacity building aspect of it. And then the implementation aspect of it is another part that you can apply for where you already have the planning aspect of it in place. You can see here there's a 75-25% cost share, and that particular one is due February 29th. So that time frame is a little bit shorter, but your state may likely already be working on this. It's another opportunity for agencies to come together and talk about what your state needs might be in terms of data that would support that. I'm not going to read those individual eligible activities, but you can take a look at that. We will share the slides after the meeting, but it gives you a sense of what each category you can be doing with that funding. Right alongside those BRIC grants are the flood mitigation assistance programs. Many states have huge challenges with flood mitigation. This one's for $800 million over 3 years. And again, you can see that 3-year cycle you have to spend the money. And you can see the breakdown there where how the millions are going to the different types of activities. Again, the capability and capacity building is a little bit less. You can see they're really focusing on a flood risk mitigation type projects that include implementation. Eligible applicants then again are states and tribes, but in both the BRIC and the flood mitigation assistance program, you can have sub-applicants that are local organizations. So that's something for you to think about. Now, all of these are going to be in that document that I shared with Arthur that you'll have access to. So if this doesn't seem like it's enough detail for you, that was by design. You're going to want to take a look at those grant opportunities, I think, across the board, and look at the ones that fit your agency or your organization the best. Next slide, Thomas.
Okay, so this is
share a little bit about the transportation side with you. So take it away, Thomas.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks a lot for that. I'm going to briefly go over a few of the larger transportation grants in a moment. And while I do so, I got these 6 Hawaii DOT goals up here. And so when I'm going over these grants, I think it's a good idea to actually just think about how you can match these goals against different grant opportunities. So that's one of the big things that, grant assessors look for is what different goals is it supporting within their own agency. So the first big one is the Protect grant, and this is designed to increase transportation resilience infrastructure against natural disasters. And through funding and technical assistance, the grant is supporting states and local governments in planning and implementing projects that enhance infrastructure resilience and mitigating the effects of climate challenges. So it is an annual program. As you see, it's 80% federal funding, and then 20% would have to be matched by the state. And there's a pretty significant pot of money. So it's 1.45 billion per year, which is a formula, and then 300 million per year, which is allocated competitively. It's a spring timeline. So even though if it's not feasible to look forward to in this spring, you can expect that to come out every year. So in 2025, it's something you could always plan for as well. In terms of aligning, different data sets to it, geospatial data can definitely be eligible for this grant opportunity under activities that help identify critical infrastructure at risk from climate change impacts. A good example would be identifying 3D bridges that are prone to flooding or route optimization efforts for emergency evacuations. There's many other different use cases that I'm sure people could think of to apply to this grant. Another big one here is the Safe Streets for All grant program, which is a part of the US DOT's initiative that was aimed at improving road safety. So the primary focus is on reducing traffic fatalities and injuries on all roadways. The program supports projects that create and implement comprehensive safety action plans and encouraging the use of strategies to enhance road safety for all users. So awards in this grant range from 200,000 to 5 million, depending on the project size. And once again, it is another annual grant, and it is currently open. Geospatial data sets that are used for safety planning would be eligible under this grant opportunity. One thing I do want to bring up about this grant, however, is not intended for state government. It's intended for MPOs, counties, and cities. That being said, when MPOs, counties, and cities apply, they could have a lot of support from the state, which goes a long way. The last big transportation grant that I'm just bringing up briefly here is the Reconnecting Communities Grant, and that's aimed at addressing longstanding impacts of previous infrastructure decisions which have divided communities. So the grant supports projects that seek to reconnect neighborhoods that are cut off from economic opportunities and essential services by highways and other barriers. It's particularly focused on funding planning, capital construction, and the removal of infrastructure such as barriers that would impede the connectivity of communities. It's a massive grant as well, $1 billion per year, 80% federal funding, and has a max project size of $2 million on the RCP side, and then no max on the neighborhood access and equity side. So you can get more information on this through the spreadsheets that we will share, as well as, once again, the PowerPoint will be shared among all participants here. And also, due to the time constraints, I know we only have an hour. You could go pretty well in detail into all these grants, but I only want to share the 3 big ones from the transportation side. But there's 29 total transportation grants out there right now, which are definitely worth exploring and that everyone should be aware of if you're exploring these types of use cases. I won't click this link now, but when you get the PowerPoint, then you could click that link and take a look at all the different transportation grants for yourself. And I'll pass the baton back on to Dan to go over specific grants local to Hawaii. I also have this sheet up. Can you see this sheet, Dan?
Right.
Perfect.
So thanks, Thomas. So the folks on the call, you're all going to get access to this. Obviously, I can't go through all of these, but I want to focus on a couple things. When you go to grants.gov, you can pull a report like this. And what I did here is I focused on those that are eligible for states. You're all often going to see, and you're going to look for that in two columns. You're going to see your state or national or something like that, either in the eligibility column or in the geographic availability column. In this case, all you have to do once you pull a report like that, and remember in grants.gov, you can actually put Hawaii in as a tagged word, and it will look for things related to Hawaii. The problem with that is you'd miss anything that was national or open to states. So you got to be a little more succinct in what you want to ask for when you go to grants.gov. So I looked for all those that rely on states and open to specific. Now, in your list, you're going to see a few that I included related to local governments because those are issues that I have heard that are relevant to Hawaii. One of those was homelessness. That was a governor's initiative. So there's some information in here on homelessness, and I wanted to include that. You'll also see the ones that we included in terms of the environmental side listed in here already, and I highlighted those for you. Each of these links will take you somewhere to the notice of funding opportunity and all of the details that you would need to know more about these grants. So hopefully something like this will help you to understand, first and foremost, what's available. Secondly, how it fits with the kinds of work that your organization does. And of course, thirdly, all the details about how you would apply and get access to that grant. One of the things we have noticed in just about every grant that we look at is most of the agencies are really looking for collaboration, and you as an organization or who's ever applying to work with other organizations to bring that all together. So that's about as far as I'm going to go into the spreadsheet, but it is available to you after the fact, and I hope that you'll make good use of that. So Brandon, I think, or Thomas, I think it goes back to you in this case. Thanks for running.
Yes, it does. Yeah, so I know we've been talking about grants, but I want to give a concrete example here about how geospatial data is supporting some of these initiatives. And one of our clients, the Illinois DOT, is actually a great example. So the risk of pedestrian fatalities raises a lot when walkways are separated from travel lanes. And this makes sense because when a bike lane or a sidewalk ends in the middle of someone's walk, the natural instinct isn't just to turn around and find another sidewalk that will connect you to your final destination. no, most people will either continue walking on the road, even if there's no sidewalk there, or cross the road if there's a sidewalk on the other side, often without looking. And there's usually not going to be a crosswalk there. That'd be a pretty big coincidence. So just items like that significantly raises pedestrian fatalities. And to reduce this risky behavior, and thus the number of pedestrians that are involved in these dangerous crashes, a complete pedestrian network can be used. And this is when we partnered with the Illinois DOT and extracted this statewide transportation network for them. So the DOT was confident that by utilizing this full transportation network that includes crosswalks, sidewalks, and bike lanes, they could pretty easily identify any gaps that could cause this behavior and then prioritize these areas to develop further infrastructure. And this is a visual of where some of those sidewalk gaps are. So with data like this, it makes safety planning incredibly easier. You shouldn't have to wait for a crash to happen in an area to make a change. And transportation safety data sets like this can be pretty transformative towards switching the narrative from being proactive rather than reactive. And this is where the safety grants comes into play. So connecting important real use cases like this to specific grant opportunities will greatly increase your success rate when you're applying for these grants. So finding the real use cases and connecting it with one, if not more, of the agency's goals is a great first step when looking at these opportunities. And I will let Brandon take the reign here on these next couple slides.
Thomas, I kind of wish we just stopped there because you did such a good job with that piece. Well, yeah, there's only a couple more slides here, and before I kind of wrap this piece up, you'll note that through the presentation here, you know, geospatial is the backbone in terms of what we're talking about. And you know, we haven't really talked too much about our products, and that's intentional because we want you to think about this as something how you localize it within your market. And I know we already had a question about some of the data sets, and I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end, but it's very important to understand what we're trying to achieve here is greater than just data development. It's data that empowers decision making. And when we think about decision making, that's important today. This case study is actually a really good example that I suspect will also resonate with many on this call here, because I think you're going to be able to relate to it. And what we did here, so essentially this is a project, and this aligns work that we're doing with NOAA, so their Office for Coastal Management, and the Texas Water Development Board. And what we did is we looked at an area just under 13,000 square miles, and we took our the land cover data that we had extracted for that area from the aerial imagery, and we looked at impervious surfaces and tree canopy and vegetation. Effectively, what we were trying to understand is the disparities or inequalities between impervious surfaces and tree canopy, which are often the primary determinants for increased heat within communities and a great understanding of inequity. So to take it a step further, what we did is we leveraged this base layer information and we integrated it with census information. And what we did is essentially by taking public source information, it's just about utilizing it in a way that starts to paint a picture. So from starting off with, you know, building footprints, driveways, pavement around a property, and integrating that data set with census information and extrapolating it in a way, you're able to start to tell a story. And these are the stories that will resonate with people outside the industry, meaning outside of GIS users. And they'll start to understand the value of this. Because what this map demonstrates is a direct correlation between income, meaning the lower income communities, and higher amounts of percentage impervious within their communities, and therefore the greatest risk in extreme heat affecting them. And just to measure that outcome, essentially what the primary takeaway was from that study is, and this is all public, this information, we have this as a case study online, so we're happy to share this as well. And this is actually something that could easily be done in any community in Hawaii. But ultimately, the takeaway in this scenario is households, I'm going to read this because I think it stands out and important, but essentially households in the bottom 20th percentile of income had an average of 48% impervious land cover on their properties, versus houses in the top 20th percentile had an average of 36.5% impervious land cover, which, all things considered, it doesn't, those numbers don't sound too significant. But when you start diving into the data so much deeper, you really understand how, and you start integrating things like actual heat measurements, it validates the assumptions. And if anything, what this information can be used for is to support grant applications. To give a concrete example, the USDA right now has $1 billion available to help support urban tree planting. And one of the criteria is you have to be able to demonstrate communities that are most at risk so that you can receive the funds to do it. A map like this and this sort of information, not only is it extremely powerful, but it also can help you succeed in getting more resources to benefit your communities. And these are only a couple of examples that we've given here today. This kind of rounds out our presentation, if I'm not mistaken. So Thomas, you can go to the next slide. And I just want to, leave a couple of thoughts we talked about a little bit about the geospatial data. We talked about some of the grants. By no means could we ever encompass and, target every single opportunity that's available to you guys. And from that, if you have additional questions, we're more than welcome to address those on a one-on-one meeting. We'll also have some time left on this call. But I hope what you're able to do from this, or a takeaway from this presentation, I should say, is that you can align geospatial data to an output that equates to that geospatial strategy. And, just a reminder in terms of that geospatial strategy, what I mean, that's in terms of building tools that are supporting risk assessment and vulnerabilities. You're talking about infrastructure planning and design, and ultimately improving your local communities. So that's all we have to say. I know Arthur brought this up to us earlier about perhaps doing a deeper dive presentation in terms of our actual features that we've extracted, including some of the work that we've done in Hawaii. We'd be more than happy to do that at a later date and give you guys a little bit more of a technical background for those GIS folks that are on the call. But I do want to say thank you. I also want to thank Thomas and Dan for joining me on the call. And Thomas and Dan both probably did actually more legwork than I did. So thank you guys for that. And yeah, we have about 20 minutes or so for questions. So if you have those, please, Arthur, I'm not sure if we want folks to unmute themselves or raise their hand. What's the best element here?
Yeah, it's pretty informal. So if you have a question, please go ahead and unmute yourself and just jump right in.
While people are thinking about that, I can read. Marcy had a question that was previously related to the start of the presentation. Thomas, can you just go to slide 5? And the question was, what resolution is the data set? Where can we access it? So as I mentioned, there's an open 1 meter data set that's been released by NOAA. It's essentially a conversion of our high resolution vector product, and it's an impervious canopy and open water data set. So I included the link in terms of the questions. That link that I sent was just a direct message, so I'm gonna send it to everyone. But the resolution of the data set, like I said, is 1 meter raster that's publicly available, but Ecopia retains a high resolution product, a vector product that's derived at a 1 to 300 scale. Or if you're thinking imagery, that's derived from a 6-inch pixel. In certain cases, it is a 12-inch pixel, depending on imagery availability. But it's a pretty darn good product, especially considering that historically these solutions were done at a 30 meter or 10 meter stuff that you've seen from either NOAA or the USGS or other groups that have produced national land cover data sets. Do we have any questions from anyone? And other than Marcy, thank you for that question in the chat.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank you all, Brandon, Thomas, and Dan, for joining us today. Hopefully people got some good information from it. I did put links to a couple of the documents that Dan sent me. One was a federal grant opportunity, and I shortened the file names, Dan, sorry. One was
That's
a
okay.
federal grant opportunities, and the other is non-government funding opportunities. So those are both in the chat. I'm going to move them to our SharePoint site, and I'll put links to that in the YouTube description when it's uploaded to you, when the recording's uploaded to YouTube. That does require your Office 365 login. So that one's restricted to just Hawaii.gov folks. Also going to put a link in the chat to our YouTube channel, which you can periodically check to see if we've got the recording up there, but I'll also send out an email to everyone when the recording is up there with a direct link to the recording. So again, last opportunity, last call for questions. Okay, I don't see anything. So thank you all again for joining us. Thank you to the Ecopia AI folks, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Arthur.
you.
And thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot, everyone.